Hello everyone, I'm Jayshree. Welcome to my channel and to this tutorial for the Crochet Puff Stitch Beanie. And as the name says, the stitch that we'll be mostly using is the puff stitch. Apart from that, it's the single crochet. So we'll begin the pattern off with the ribbing right at the bottom, and then we'll work the body of the beanie. And to do that, we'll need 2 hooks, which is a 5mm hook and a 6mm hook. The 5mm hook I'll use for the ribbing, and the 6mm hook, which is a recommended hook for the yarn I'm using, I'll use for the body of the beanie. Now the yarn that I'm using is this Lollipop Sparkle Chunky, and like I said, the hook, the recommended hook, is a 6mm hook. It's 100% acrylic yarn, and each skein is 100 grams or 142 meters. I need, for my particular beanie, I'll be using just over 1 skein of yarn. Now the beanie that I'll be making in this tutorial fits a head circumference of 22 inches or 56 centimeters. So this pattern is rather easy to adjust. Should you feel that you'd like to make it for children, you could reduce the number of rounds that we work in between. And in the tutorial, I will show you how to as we go along. Or it is easy to adjust the other way as well. If you'd like it to make it any bigger, you could increase the number of rounds that you work. Okay, so let's begin. Hope you enjoy this tutorial. We'll begin the ribbing using our 5mm hook, and we'll start off with that slip knot. Then it's chain 7. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Round 1 into the second chain from the hook, single crochet. So here's my first chain, and that's the second. Insert the hook into that chain, pull up a loop, yarn over, go through 2 loops on the hook. Continue with single crochets into the remaining chains. So once you're done with the round, count your stitches, making certain that you have 6 stitches running across. It's very easy to lose a stitch when working a ribbing. Round 2, chain 1 and turn. We'll now work single crochets across. However, we'll work those single crochets into the back loops. And if you look at the stitch here at the front, it's the front loop, and at the back loop. Into those back loops, we'll work single crochets. Now remember that first chain counts, that chain 1 that we worked counts as a turning chain. So we wouldn't work stitches into that chain. So into that stitch, into the back loop, we'll work our single crochets. And you continue working single crochets into the back loops only. Again, make certain that you have 6 stitches running across. So I've completed the ribbing by repeating round 2, and here you have it. And if I hold the 2 ends together and fit this around my head, it should fit just as a beanie would. This ribbing is the ribbing that you see, like here I've got a completed beanie, so you'd see it at the bottom of the beanie. Okay, so it doesn't really matter on the number of rounds we work, just make certain that when you hold it together, it fits around the head comfortably. We'll now join the 2 sides together by using slip stitches. So you'll work stitch for stitch and you'll join them with a slip stitch. Now that our ribbing is joined, we'll work single crochets all across the top of the ribbing in order for us to work our stitches easily. As you see, there are no stitches right at the top of the ribbing, so we'll work those single crochets, and to do that, begin with a chain 1. Then it's single crochet into that same stitch or space from where the chain 1 comes out of, and then it's just single crochets all across. Try to keep those single crochets as evenly spaced. So I'm just going to work 1 into the ridge and 1 next to the ridge, 1 into the ridge and 1 next to the ridge. Okay, so as we're working along, we need to also count our stitches. While we're working, we need our stitch count in an even number or in multiples of 2. So I've worked 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and I'll continue 7, 8, 9, 10, and you'll continue to the end. And once we get to the end, I'll show you how to adjust your stitch count if it is an odd number. I've worked those single crochets across and I'm at the end, and I have 71 stitches. So I need my stitch count in an even number or in multiples of 2. So to correct my stitch count, I'll work another stitch into that last, from where the last stitch came out of. Then to join, it's into that first single crochet, I'll slip stitch. Okay, so we'll now change our hook to a 6mm hook, or to a size larger, 1 size larger. Okay, at the same time, we'll turn our ribbing inside out so that this edge here where we had worked the slip stitches is on the inside. We're now working on the right side and we'll be working round 1. So to work for this pattern, as I said, it's a puff stitch. So to work a puff stitch, our first puff stitch, we'll pull up that first loop that's on the hook to about 1 centimeter. Okay, then it's yarn over, insert your hook into that same stitch and pull up a loop. Elongate the loop to the length of the first loop. Then it's yarn over, insert the hook into the same stitch and pull up a loop, elongate it again to the same length as the two other loops. Yarn over, insert the hook into the stitch, the same stitch, pull up the loop and elongate it, yarn over and go through all the loops on the hook. Then it's chain 1 to secure, and that completes the puff stitch. So our pattern for round 1 is puff stitch, skip a stitch, puff stitch, skip a stitch. So we'll skip the next stitch and we'll work a puff stitch into the stitch. And again, to work the puff stitch, it's yarn over, insert the hook into that stitch, pull up a loop and elongate the loop. Then again, yarn over, insert the hook into that same stitch, pull up a loop and elongate the loop. Yarn over, insert the hook into the stitch, pull up a loop, elongate the loop. Yarn over, insert the hook into the same stitch, pull up a loop and elongate the loop. It's yarn over and pull through all the loops on the hook. Then it's a chain 1 to secure the stitch. So again, skip a stitch and into the next stitch, a puff stitch. That's 2, 3, and 4. So you'll continue with skip a stitch, puff stitch, skip a stitch, puff stitch to the end of the round. I'm at the end of round 1 and I've worked my stitch pattern all across. I have 1 stitch to go. So to join into that stitch above the puff stitch, I'll slip stitch to join. Round 2, slip stitch again into that space in between the 2 puff stitches. Okay, so we'll now work the puff stitches in between the puff stitches from the round before. And to work our first puff stitch, we'll elongate that loop to about 1 centimeter and we'll continue working the puff stitch. Then in between the next 2 puff stitches, we'll work a puff stitch. You'll continue with round 2, working the puff stitches in between the stitches from the round before. Continue to the end of the round. I'm at the end of round 2 and I've worked my last puff stitch. So to join, it's into that stitch above the puff stitch right at the start. I'll slip stitch. I've now completed rounds 3 to round 7, and what I've done is I've repeated round 2. So I've repeated round 2 5 more times. And at this point, you can decide how many repeats of round 2 it is that you'd like, depending on the fit of the beanie that you'd like. So if you're working this beanie for children, you'd work fewer rounds of round 2. of the repeat of round 2. And maybe if you're working this beanie for bigger head sizes, you would work more rounds of the repeat of round 2. So you could increase the number of rounds that you work, but in my case I needed to work round 2 5 more times, and I've completed round 7. So for round 8, which is a decrease round, and we'll be working more decrease rounds as we go along, to sort of taper off the beanie at the top. Okay, so what I'll do here is I'll slip stitch in between those 2 puff stitches right at the start. So for a decrease round, I'll work 2 puff stitches and then a decrease. So for my first puff stitch, and then the second stitch, and now for the decrease, which I'll be working into 2 of these spaces. So I'll work the puff stitch, but I'll work it into 2 spaces. So it's yarn over, insert the hook into that first space, pull up a loop, yarn over, insert the hook into the next space, pull up a loop, and I'll do it twice more into that second space to complete the puff stitch. Then it's yarn over and go through all the loops on your hook, and it's chain 1 to secure. So I've worked 1 puff stitch into 2 spaces, and then again it's 2 puff stitches into the next 2 spaces and a decrease into the next 2 spaces. So let's do that again with the puff stitch into the next space, that's my second puff stitch into the next space, and now for the decrease into these 2 spaces. So you'll continue with 2 puff stitches into 2 spaces and then a decrease into the next 2 spaces to the end of the round. I've completed round 8, that decrease round, and I slip stitched into the stitch above the puff stitch at the start to join. I then worked round 9 and round 10, which was a repeat of round 2. Round 11, a decrease round where I worked 2 puff stitches and then a decrease into the next 2 spaces. Round 12, a decrease round, and round 13, a decrease round. Now you'll see at the top of the beanie, I have a little opening here, and that's about right. So I'll fasten off and cut off the excess yarn, leaving behind a long enough tail to help me seam up this little opening at the top. So using the yarn needle, you'll seam the opening together. And you can take this, the tail end, to the underside where you'll weave it in. Now with the beanie all complete and the top seam together, you can now fasten off and weave in all those edges. And I'll show you how to weave, how I weave in the edges. So again, using the yarn needle on the wrong side, I'll just stitch in the tail end. So you're actually looking to just sort of stitch in the tail end, moving it from side to side or working it from back and forth, just to sort of lose that end into the stitches on the wrong side. And then the remaining bit I can cut off. So yes, that's how I weave in the edges, and there's just one more to weave in right at the center, and that would complete the beanie.